Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 285, The Religion of Ancient Palestine. This is a 77-page intermediate length work. Link in the description as always to my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links are to my books, blogs. This goes squarely in the academic section, of course. It's an interesting work, but it's slightly misleading because when people think of Palestine today, they think of the civic and political entity of Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and so forth. This is about religious developments within the general region, all the way over into what was then Babylon, down into Egypt, some of these other groups, various tribes in the Levant region that existed in the antiquity, and really how these religions co-evolved, essentially. How they influenced what would become Judeo-Christianity. Because, of course, Judaism is largely, in large part, an adaptation of Babylonian and other more ancient lore, which in turn adapts from Sumeria, which in turn adapts to whatever civilization built Göbekli Tepe probably, and had some sort of Copper Age primitive beliefs. It's all religious evolution, and these groups split off from one another, become tribal, and then they remix much later as empires begin to flourish. And so this is one part linguistic work and one part anthropological study. A lot of it has to do with how the ruling classes of various groups sort of adapted the deities of their own and other cultures, and how those things intertwined and evolved with one another. For example, it wasn't until the Babylonian captivity, which was not an enslavement per se, but captivity in a general regional sense, of the Jews, that Judaism began to actually write down what had been mostly oral traditions. There is a heavy Babylonian influence, therefore, in the Bible, if you actually read it in the Old Testament. A lot of the Jewish religion is fundamentally structured off of Babylonian lore. This has happened in other religions too. The religion of Rome, which eventually became Catholicism, Proto-Christianity, and then standardized Roman Church. The Pope literally wears a fish hat like Dagon. This is not some sort of conspiracy theory. This is the evolution of that particular religious garb. Of course, Catholics would say that's evidence of you're claiming idolatry or heresy or something. I simply claim it's part of religious history. So it's a very interesting work. But again, it doesn't really get into the civic or political side of what we would know as Palestine. Of course, that term, was also used for mandatory Palestine under the British end of the colonial era. It's been Palestina. It's been, sort of used for various slightly malleable regions in that general area. But this is mostly about religious influence from outside groups, especially Egypt and Babylon. Those are the two big ones because those are the two big empires at the time that this development begins over the course of several centuries of what would become later on the standard Christian religion as well, creating the New Testament therefrom later. So it's definitely highly recommended. If you're into religious history, this one's a little bit less linguistic, which actually I sort of like. I really like linguistics, but sometimes I want things that are more analytical and more historical in nature, as opposed to dwelling just on language. And this looks at the evolution, again, of some of these figures, these deities and ritual practices within this context. Again, link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links are to my books, blogs, part of the Creation series. This is the second to last one I'll release. I just created the final one actually as well. We'll see how long it takes for it to actually process and be allowed for publishing. Amazon is definitely slower in the wake of coronavirus, so bear with me. I'm doing the best that I can. That's about all. Peace out.